The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde is a philosophical and Gothic novel that explores themes of morality, aestheticism, and the consequences of decadence. The story revolves around the central character, Dorian Gray, a young and handsome man who becomes the subject of a portrait painted by the artist Basil Hallward. The narrative begins with Dorian Gray posing for a portrait painted by Basil Hallward, a talented artist who becomes infatuated with Dorian's beauty. As the portrait nears completion, Dorian expresses a wish that he could remain forever young while the portrait ages instead, preserving his beauty for all time. This wish sets in motion a supernatural and moral dilemma that forms the core of the novel. Dorian becomes friends with Lord Henry Wotton, a hedonistic and witty aristocrat who introduces him to a philosophy of aestheticism that promotes the pursuit of pleasure and beauty above all else. Lord Henry's influence and Dorian's own desires lead him to embrace a life of indulgence and excess, detached from moral consequences. As Dorian indulges in a hedonistic lifestyle, he remains outwardly untouched by the consequences of his actions. The portrait, hidden away in his home, begins to bear the marks of his moral decay. Unlike Dorian, the portrait ages and reflects the corruption of his soul. Dorian's pursuit of pleasure becomes increasingly immoral, leading to deception, manipulation, and even acts of cruelty. One of the novel's significant subplots involves Dorian's romantic entanglement with Sybil Vane, a talented actress. Initially infatuated with Sybil's acting ability and beauty, Dorian proposes to her. However, when her performance falters one evening, Dorian cruelly rejects her, prioritizing aesthetic perfection over genuine emotion. Devastated by his rejection, Sybil takes her own life. The tragic outcome of Sybil's death begins to weigh on Dorian's conscience, but instead of remorse, he is intrigued by the lack of change in his own appearance. The portrait, however, bears the scars of his actions, and its transformation becomes increasingly grotesque and hideous. Dorian, now fully embracing a life of decadence, surrounds himself with luxury and immoral pleasures. His reputation in society remains untarnished, as his physical appearance stays youthful and attractive. Dorian's dual existence, outwardly respectable in society but morally corrupt in private, creates a stark contrast between his public persona and the hidden reality of his portrait. As the years pass, Dorian becomes increasingly detached from the consequences of his actions. His friendship with Lord Henry deepens, and he continues to exploit others for his own amusement. Meanwhile, the portrait becomes a horrifying reflection of his inner corruption, showcasing the moral decay that accompanies his hedonistic lifestyle. The novel explores themes of temptation, sin, and the corrupting influence of a purely aesthetic pursuit of pleasure. Wilde uses Dorian's character to critique the societal emphasis on superficial appearances and the dangers of prioritizing aesthetic beauty over moral integrity. The portrait serves as a symbolic representation of the consequences of unchecked hedonism and the degradation of the soul. As Dorian's life spirals further into debauchery, he becomes increasingly paranoid about the portrait being discovered and the truth of his immoral actions being revealed. He takes drastic measures to hide the painting, leading to a series of events that culminate in a dramatic and morally charged climax. The novel's resolution involves a confrontation between Dorian and his own conscience, embodied by the grotesque image in the portrait. Dorian, confronted with the physical manifestation of his sins, becomes desperate to rid himself of the burden. In a fit of guilt and self-loathing, he stabs the portrait, ultimately leading to his own demise. The conclusion of The Picture of Dorian Gray is a powerful commentary on the inevitable consequences of a life devoid of moral responsibility. Dorian's fate serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked desires, the pursuit of superficial pleasure, and the disregard for the consequences of one's actions. In the end, Dorian's body is found aged and withered, while the portrait returns to its original state of youthful beauty. The novel concludes with the image of the restored portrait, a stark reminder of the ephemeral nature of beauty and the inescapable consequences of a life lived without regard for ethical principles. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray remains a timeless exploration of the human condition, morality, and the consequences of unchecked desires. Through Dorian's journey, Wilde challenges societal norms and critiques the superficial values that prioritize appearance over substance. The novel's enduring relevance lies in its profound examination of the complexities of human nature and the price one pays for a life devoid of moral accountability.